Mayor. Joe gave out a lot of recognition. I'd like to give some recognition to Joe. Joe's a fantastic mayor, so if we could give a round of applause for Mayor. I have a quick couple things on the general fund. I hope you can't tell I have a sore throat that I'm fighting right now, so bear with me on that. My goal is to, if we could go to the next slide. My goal is to give you a one-on-one on the general fund, because that's been the topic of conversation in the city recently, is our general fund. If you could go to the next slide, please. The context setting this, so our total city budget is $52.6 million. The general fund, next slide please. The general fund is about a quarter of that. It can range, depending, if we have a $3 million project or a large project in one department or another, that percentage can change a little, but a general rule of thumb is that we're looking at about a quarter of the budget. Next slide, please. The departments that make up that budget are mostly administration, 26%, parks, 24%, non-departmental, that's things like contingency, reserves, that kind of thing for a rainy day fund type of thing. Community development, 14%, and then court, small little piece at 2%. So these are the funds that make up the general fund. The reason being that we have funds in the beginning is because different types of money have different legal requirements associated with them. And so cities and other government agencies sort them into funds in order to properly track and make sure money goes to the correct place. Like, you wouldn't want your sewer bill going towards a community event. You would want it going towards sewer operations. So that's why we have this. If you could go to the next slide, please. Now, speaking of those revenues, these are the revenues that make up the general fund. You'll see the largest is property taxes. Another large piece of it is grants. Obviously, that's the most fluctuatable because you have to get awarded grants, and some grants are very large, like the $1 million parks grant that got mentioned. That was awarded to the general fund, as well as the transportation system plan update. So that can vary a bunch, but in general, property taxes and then franchise fees are another huge one. This is, you'll see it sometimes called user fees. It's essentially just underground utility companies that are paying for the privilege of using our right-of-ways. And so think of like cable company, power company, internet, things like that. They would pay a franchise fee. Another big one is transfers, licenses and permits, interest, and the local government interest pool. But the main one is property taxes, so I want to focus on that for just a sec, if you could go to the next slide. So property taxes in Oregon are in a pretty interesting place. So a lot of states around the country struggle with property tax revenue as a reliable leg of their funding, but in Oregon we're kind of in a particularly interesting situation, because in the 90s there were two ballot measures that were passed by citizens. Those are Measures 5 and Measure 50. I'm not going to go into like which ones are which. The point is we both have them now, so we both deal with it now. But collectively, those two capped permanent tax rates at $5 for schools and $10 for collective general governments. So general governments being city, county, fire, those kinds of things. And then schools being school districts and other types. Another component of these measures, it made tax rates. So as you see on the bottom, Scappoose has a tax rate that is 3.2268 per thousand of assessed property value. And so one of the components was it made it fixed. Cities cannot change their rate unless they go out for an operating levy, but that only has a limit of 5 years. And then the last component, this is kind of the biggest one, is it back before these measures passed, the property taxes were based on real market value, so what the home would have sold for on the real market. They differentiated that, and so now we have what's called assessed value. And assessed value took the property tax, or the property value in 95-96 and froze it, and it can only increase 3% every year as a maximum. If you go to the next slide, so in the blue here we have real market value. You can see it fluctuates, it goes with the ups and downs of the economy. You can even see the big drop after the '08 crash. And then we have assessed value. That just continues at that 3% rate every single year, and it doesn't have any opportunity to reflect what things are actually costing to provide services, what kinds of pay employees are expecting to be able to afford to live. All those kinds of things it doesn't consider because we are fixed on the 3% every year, whether or not the cost of doing business goes up by more than 3% or not. If you could go to the next slide, please. So right here, this is where the city is currently at. We have in our general fund currently an operating deficit of about $600,000 to $1 million. And there's different ways to parse that out, that's why it's a range. But this doesn't mean the city is, going into debt, that we can't pay our bills or anything like that. What this means is that we're relying more than we should on cash carryover from the previous year. And every single year we eat into that a little bit more until we're having a depreciating value of where we're starting every single fiscal year. So if we didn't do anything for 1 year, we would be okay. Even 2 years, we would be okay. Where we would get into trouble is if in about 6-ish years. If we did nothing, if we didn't take a proactive approach to right-size the general fund in some way, that is when the city would start to be in trouble and looking at more dire situations. So we're trying to do the responsible thing and get ahead of that. If you could go to the next slide, please. So the two basic levers, this is true of any budget of any scale. This is true for our own personal finance too. What can you do when you have a deficit? You can look at your expenses and what you're spending and take a hard look at that. Or you can look at how can we bring in more money? How can we increase revenues through all of the different tools that fund the general fund? Can we go to the next slide, please? So we were curious about this. So last year at the annual town meeting, if you attended, you might remember filling this out. But it inquired if, for police and park services in particular, if you would be willing to pay a small general service fee that would be incorporated in your monthly utility bill. And granted, small sample size, and the most civically engaged people attend the annual town meeting. But the large majority was yes. We would be willing to pay something small. I want to point out, you see on the bottom of the left-hand side, you see on water bill, not property taxes, so that's a key one. Like I mentioned earlier, we can't raise property taxes. We can do an operating levy that only gets us so far and only for up to 5 years. Another one, emphasize small in all caps. I think those are the keynotes. But yeah, we see the people that are valuing services, and especially in terms of law enforcement, we heard from the community very overwhelmingly that 24/7 police coverage is really important to Scappoose, and also local law enforcement that has a Scappoose feel to it is important to Scappoose. And then for parks, I mean, Scappoose and Columbia County in general are such a gateway to nature, and having maintained access to that nature where it's appropriately staffed, and where if someone on a large residential property is willing to sell their property to the city for a great deal, do we want to have the funds where we can sort of shift and pivot quickly and make a deal on that to provide more park space? So that's sort of the funding side, that's sort of the revenue building side. If you would go to the next slide. So what about level of service? What we're doing? I'm glad you asked. Now that you've graduated General Fund 101, let's meet and talk about it in the cafeteria. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. That's all we have for you here today. So if you can help us, we really would appreciate it. It would take probably no more than 30 minutes. And then our partners will still be out here to answer questions. Please, city staff, city council will be out there. So if you have any questions for us, please don't hesitate. But thanks again for attending, and thank you, Stephanie.